Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our fourth webinar series. This is the first in our special presentation series, We Bring You the Experts. So today we will be using our Zoom platform, and this is education purposes only. And every situation is unique, and the information provided in this presentation is for educational purposes and not specific advice for your situation. When we get started, we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. When the questions will be available for the presenter, and you can add your questions in a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you scroll your mouse down, you will see some icons, and you'll see a Q&A box down there. And that's where you'll put your questions and answers, your questions and where the answers will be. There is also a little chat box. If you're having any issues, then please let us know, and we will try to help you as best as we can. So today we have the pleasure of having a guest speaker with us, Dr. J.B. Orange, who will be presenting on communicating effectively. Special emphasis will be on communicating with individuals with various forms of dementia. Dr. J.B. Orange is a professor in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Western University in London, Canada. He also is the scientific director of the Canadian Centre for Activity and Aging at Western University. He is an associate scientist with Lawson Health Research Institute at London, Canada. I will turn the presentation over now to Dr. Orange. Welcome.
Great. Thanks, Dina. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this educational session. I want to thank Dina and Susan for presenting this session and allowing me to come and speak with you this morning. I have some slides that I'm going to share with you on the screen for a moment, but let me just say at the beginning that if you wish to have a copy of these slides, then you can get a hold of Dina or Susan over at the Alzheimer's Society of London in Middlesex, and I'll make those available for you, okay? All right, Dina, I'm going to share my screen now, okay?
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Continue this one. No, that's not the one I want.
That's okay.
Yep, here we go. All right, everyone, I hope you can all see those slides as we work through the sessions this morning. We have about an hour or so. I'm going to try and make available time at the end for questions, but if there are some that come up during the session, by all means, as Dina's pointed out, use the Q&A session or the chat box, and Dina and or Susan will let me know about the questions. Okay.
So sorry to interrupt, JB. I just wanted to mention that we're not seeing your slides, so I'm not sure.
Ooh. Okay. Let me just see what happened here. All right. Let me go in. Okay. How about this? How about, hang on a sec here. How about now? Can you see them now?
No, not yet.
Okay. I'm not
It's
seeing
okay.
where
It's okay.
I'm having.
Is there, do you have two screens happening right now, or? Oh, I see something.
How's that?
There you go.
Got them?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Super. All right. So let's move along here. As with anything in presentations from an academic at a university, I have to let you know about my disclosures that I don't hold any financial interest or arrangements with the Alzheimer's Society of London and Middlesex. I don't have any pharmaceutical affiliations or medical device affiliations with various media outlets or publishing companies. And my presentation is really based on scientific literature and it's evidence-informed. I also need to let you know that I have the following grants that I hold from the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, as well as from the Ontario Brain Institute on the Ontario Neurodegenerative Research Initiative and the Canadian Consortium for Neurodegeneration and Aging, and one from the Canadian Centre for Aging Brain Health Innovation and then a final one from Employment Skills Development Canada. So just so you know where I'm getting my research grant funds. Okay. So part of the session that I want to go through today has the following 4 topics. I want to talk a little bit about the complexity of human communication, and specifically some issues around communication for those who have dementia, our friends and relatives, and why communication is important for us as caregivers, and then hopefully spend the majority of my time on some strategies that you might find useful. So there are 4 terms I want to talk about, and they include speech, language, communication, and cognition. The term speech refers to the ways in which we make sounds. It's a complex neurodynamic process of using our lungs, our larynx, the resonance cavity of our nasal cavity, oral cavity, and then changing the shape of this tube that we use to make these sounds. It's a complex process of making the 45 sounds in the speech sound system, and it really refers to all the nerves and muscles and support structures for actually making the sounds. The second term, though, is language. This is different from speech, and we think of language as the set of symbols that we use to convey an idea. These symbols represent the 45 sounds that we say. It also involves the 26 letters of the alphabet that we use, as well as facial expressions, gestures, postures that convey an idea. In all languages, there are a set of rules that govern how these symbols are used. And in the English language system, we have a rule system called phonology or phonotactics that governs how we put these sounds together. For example, in the English language, there are no words that begin with the sound y or end with the sound h. And so there are rules that govern how these sounds go together. Second rule system in the English language is grammar. The example you have on the screen is the boy ran to the store. That's bad grammar. It should be past tense. The boy ran to the store. A third rule-based system in language in English is syntax. It is the order of these meaningful units and how they go together. So the example on the screen is to store the boy that ran. We reorder those words and it means the sentence, the boy ran to the store. A fourth rule-based system that has particular relevance for today's session is called semantics. And semantics refers to really all of the hundreds of thousands of meanings of words that we have in our brain. And for most of us, that's on the left side of our brain, which is essentially our large dictionary. So defining the word car, for example, means we have to go, for most of us who speak English and have it on the left side of our brain, to that mental dictionary and that section that has information related to 4 wheels, steering wheel made of metal, has an engine, requires gas, transports 1 to 6 people. That's the definition of car, and that is part of the semantic system. I didn't go to the section in my mental dictionary for cat, or catastrophe, or caterpillar, but I went for car. And for many of our friends and relatives who have dementia, it's this semantic system, rule-based system, that's preferentially ravaged. You see on the screen the term pragmatics, which refers to how we use our language in certain contexts. That is, I'm using my sort of webinar type talk today, which is very different from the language I would use if I were to go to the grocery store and talk to the cashier, or if I were going to the theater and talk to people there, or I'm on a job interview, or I'm talking with my wife and my children. All different contexts influence how we use language. The third term I want to talk about is communication. And as a speech language pathologist, we define communication as in 2 facets. One is the exchange of ideas or concepts between 2 or more entities or people. And secondly, it's the mechanism whereby we establish and maintain and change relationships. And communication has multiple forms, including speech, including language, and includes hearing, which I haven't talked about. But we think of communication as these 2 components: exchange of information, and secondly, this mechanism whereby we have these relationships with other individuals. And communication is dyadic, or at least involves 2 entities. As you can see on this side of the screen, hope the cursor is working there, that we have an output side. And currently I'm speaking, I use my word processor to write it, and I'm also using facial expression, body posture, closeness, proxemics to one another, as well as other forms of expressing language. On the input side, which is on the right side of your screen, you, I hope, are understanding what I'm saying. You can hear me, listening comprehension. You can read the material. it's typed properly and the right size. But you're also picking up on my nonverbal communication, facial expressions, body posture. And we also have the other channels of smell and touch and taste, which we don't often use, but they are mechanisms and modalities or channels that we use to communicate with one another. The fourth term I want to talk about is cognition. And cognition really refers to all those mental activities that we use to capture sensory information and then transform it, reduce it, elaborate it, and store it, and then call it back up again. And really, cognition refers to all those mental activities where we gain knowledge, we organize information, and we use what we've learned. Cognition is made up of a variety of mental operations, including memory systems and processes, attention systems and processes, judgment, reasoning, insightfulness, among other systems and processes. So why do I talk about these four terms? Well, when we think about enhancing communication for someone with dementia, we have to think about strategies that are related to speech, which, as you may recall, is the making of the sounds. We have to think about the symbols that we use in the order that those symbols occur. And then we also have to think about how we're establishing, maintaining that relationship with one another, and then all of the issues around judgments and insightfulness and attentions and memories. And all of those come into play for someone who has dementia. Why? Because dementia, as you can see on this next screen, is really a syndrome, a collection of behavioral and neuropsychiatric symptoms that interfere with people's everyday lives. It's not a part of normal aging, and it refers to changes and declines progressively in levels of functioning, and it's not explained by psychiatric disorders, and it really is a cognitive impairment that has behavioral manifestations where this HX, the history from a client and a knowledgeable informant, as well as objective measurements, give us data that shows that this person's performances in a variety of areas are not working very well. And these areas or domains that are impaired include this 5A, which is, in the technical sense, an impaired ability to acquire and to remember new information, which is essentially memory problems. B refers to reasoning or judgments or insightfulness, where people have blunted awareness of what's going on about decision making. Thirdly, in the C area, individuals with dementia may have visual spatial difficulties, that is, being able to see foreground from background. Is the door opening away from you or towards you? The 5D that's highlighted here in red is one that's of particular relevance and interest to me because as a speech language pathologist, I'm interested in the language and communication skills of people with the syndrome of dementia. And of course, people with dementia will have language and communication and sometimes speech difficulties. This 5E refers to changes in personality. We know that that occurs in people with dementia as well too. So this definition of dementia requires an impairment of at least two of these 5 areas: memory, judgments, visual spatial, language, and changes in personality. Now, more recent definitions from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, that is DSM-5, includes this last area. You can see here number 6, called social cognition, because these ones of complex attention, executive function, learning and memory, etc., are very similar to previous definitions, but it's this social cognition that's been added in, and I highlight that because social cognition refers to the challenges that people with dementia experience in using their cognitive skills and their behaviors in various social contexts, which means sometimes they may say or do things or not say or not do things that are not appropriate for that social context. And so researchers have added that component in, and that actually gets manifest in the term that I used earlier called pragmatics, where people don't necessarily use their communication appropriately for various contexts. That might mean talking inappropriately or swearing when they shouldn't be, or talking loudly when they're in a religious context or in a library and saying things that are really not appropriate about someone else. And that's a manifestation of changes in insightfulness and judgment. Okay? Researchers and clinicians have divided dementia into 3 clinical phases. As you can see on the screen, there's an early or a mild phase, a middle or a moderate phase, and a later severe phase. And this is just a representation of the progression of people who have Alzheimer's type dementia where they're in the earlier stages, changes around mood, and as the middle or moderate stages begin to emerge, there are more declines in cognitive function. And as the disease progresses over 8 to 10 year period of time into the late severe stages, you have changes in functional autonomy, which means being able to look after yourself and do those daily chores and daily activities of bathing, dressing, eating. And there are also some changes in behavior that may be inappropriate that occur, at least according to Gautier, towards the later stages, although depending on the type of dementia, these behavior difficulties might manifest actually a little earlier. The motoricity challenges reflect inability to coordinate muscle movements and walk and use limbs for feeding yourself, etc. So we think of dementia as these three phases, three clinical phases, each lasting anywhere from 2 to 4 years, maybe a little longer depending on all sorts of other coexisting medical health problems. Now, relating that back to people with dementia and communication issues, this diagram that's on the screen now represents a relationship that we've seen in people with dementia where there are inappropriate or sometimes referred to as dysfunctional or challenging behaviors, now currently referred to as responsive behaviors, that are linked to communication problems. And my colleague, Marisa van der Nijgam, and her colleagues down in the States, developed this model to show the relationships, the correlations between communication problems here on the left-hand side of the screen to problem behaviors, and how those problem behaviors get manifest in different types of burden for family caregivers or other forms of caregivers. And these numbers, the 0.48, for example, and the 0.37, 0.51, and 0.57 are numbers that represent correlations, not causes, but correlations. And the number that's closer to 1.0 means it's a stronger correlation, that is longer or closer association and stronger links. So that, for example, in their model and their data, communication problems were moderately linked to problem behaviors. That is, the difficulties that people were describing among their relatives or friends who have dementia, like wandering, screaming, or reaching out, or inappropriate communication, are linked to these communication problems, and that these problem behaviors or responsive behaviors create different types of stressors within family caregivers, including demand burdens, that is, the family members have to do lots of physical activities related to the demands and these responsive behaviors. There's an emotional stress that happens with or occurs within the family caregivers. They're feeling overwhelmed, and then that burden that is objective means that family caregivers actually have psychological challenges and physical problems as associated with these problem behaviors that in our model are linked with moderately to communication problems. So as a researcher and also as a therapist, I want to make sure that I can minimize caregiver burdens by reducing these problem behaviors that are linked to communication problems, which means then if I can stem the tide and emergence of these communication problems, then maybe we can help reduce the manifestation and the emergence of these responsive behaviors that in turn are felt to be quite burdensome for family caregivers. And it's these challenging behaviors that are linked with these inabilities to communicate effectively. And so part of our role as researchers and clinicians is to educate and train caregivers, and the same with the Alzheimer's Society of London and Middlesex and other chapters, to educate and train caregivers, whether they're family caregivers, formal caregivers, about how to learn about these different types of dementia and how communication problems are linked to these responsive behaviors. And I applaud you for attending today's session. Several studies have shown that spouses perceive these communication difficulties as quite problematic, quite burdensome. Jeff Small and his colleagues out at University of British Columbia identified that in their study, caregivers said that relatives were just sitting there not talking, not getting anything back as part of that dyad, that couple I was talking about before, the links between expressive and receptive languages. Murray's study identified caregivers who said that they are losing their partners. They don't tell them anything. They have a long time to explain things. And it's quite problematic in having these interactions. Wright's study identified perceptions from caregivers who said they can't confide in relatives anymore. They get exhausted by these repeated questions. People get angry, people get upset, and it's quite problematic. Even children whose parents have dementia are finding it problematic and burdensome to have relationships. In Karen Parsons' study out of MUN, Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador, these particular quotes, I think, speak to the real challenges that children are experiencing in relationships with their parents as a result of the dementia and the communication problems. Even speech-language pathologists like myself are not immune to having relatives who have dementia. And Gail Neuenstadt's husband developed Alzheimer's dementia. And even with her training, it was challenging for her to have effective conversation that really isn't predictable and goes all over the place. So the evidence would suggest in literature that family caregivers are having a great deal of difficulty navigating these challenges. And there are some strategies we're going to talk about shortly, but I just wanted to reinforce some of the anxieties and frustrations and burdens that you might be experiencing. So shifting now a little bit over to some of the strategy side, given this basic information that we have so far, I'd like to sort of give a broader framework of what communication enhancement might mean for you, and then we'll get down into the weeds and some of the details shortly, but I want to sort of set a larger framework. Lots of time, super. So there are some considerations that we need to keep in mind, and our goals for enhancing communication with our relatives, including making sure the communication is really optimized, not only for the information transfer that I have listed here, that is the safety of our family members and our relatives, for ADLs, activities of daily living, like dressing, bathing, toilet, eating, or these IADLs, instrumental activities of daily living, that is managing finances, using the telephone, doing the laundry, grocery shopping, etc. But more importantly, we want to make sure that this communication is optimized for relationship maintenance and enhancing and changing, because communication is not just about this information exchange, and it is just as, if not more importantly in some occasions, about having that relationship with one another. And the fact that communication declines and erodes inextricably, progressively over the course of the dementia, family members are beginning to have those decades of links with one another eroded and changed, and the fact that you can't have those close, intimate conversations become quite burdensome. And so part of your goal is to make sure you maintain that closeness in relationship, because there's nothing more important than communication for relationships, right? Ultimately, we want to be able to optimize our quality of life, because we know that quality of life in its multiple representations, health-related quality of life, emotional-related quality of life, is linked to these relationships, and these relationships are linked to communication. And so we want to make sure that we optimize the well-being, mental and social health of our persons, our relatives who are living with dementia, and the family caregivers and other members in our immediate and distributed social networks. Some of the work that we do in our labs are to try and focus in on strategies that help minimize these responsive or dysfunction or challenging behaviors, because the literature would suggest that it's these catastrophic reactions, all of a sudden saying things that are inappropriate, or not saying things, being very quiet, that creates burdens and anxieties for family caregivers. So we want to make sure that we optimize communication to minimize these responsive behaviors. So when you are thinking about those goals, as we move a little closer down into more details, you have to reflect on, what is your agenda? What is the purpose of that interaction you're going to have with your mom or your dad or your husband or your wife or your grandpa or your ompa or your oma? So why are you communicating with them? What is it that you have in your mind about what you want to have them understand or what you want to understand from them? And so are you communicating just to get some information? Did the doctor call while you were out? Did you take your medication? Where's the pain? Or do you want to have this social connectedness with them, that relationship building? And so part of knowing what you want to achieve in communication is to sit back just for a moment and reflect, what is that I want to achieve in that interaction with my friend or my relative? Secondly, part of your communication enhancement considerations need to think about multiple options. I like to use the metaphor of multiple arrows in your quiver to try and hit the target of successful or optimized communication. And there are some strategies that they're evidence informed, we know in the literature, that work well, but they may not work consistently well all the time. And so you just have to be somewhat patient to know that maybe what worked well one time doesn't necessarily work well this time, because of the variability of communication, its complexity, but also the variability in you and your friend and relative. Recognizing that communication is this partnership, a dance, as it were, that is an exchange of information between a speaker and a listener, a writer and a reader, and a person who uses facial expressions and body language, and a person who's interpreting that. If you understand that there's this dance, as it were, this dyad, then you realize that it gets a little more complex, because sometimes you're the listener, sometimes you're the reader, sometimes you're the writer, sometimes they're the writer, the reader. And so recognizing that part of the problems may not necessarily be with you, it might be with them. Sometimes the problems may not be with them, they might be with you. So recognizing that it's a partnership in this is important as you begin to think about optimizing that communication. Communication doesn't necessarily always mean that we're talking or yakking or writing, but being an active listener or an active reader or an active observer can be very helpful to ensure that the communication is optimized. Because sometimes you don't want to jump in quickly and say or write or do actions that might otherwise not be exactly what the other person meant or intended. So sometimes just sitting there, sharing with you, holding hands, or sharing quiet moments can be just as important for maybe not information exchange as we would think of it in the traditional sense, but just as important and more important sometimes in the relationship sense of it. Number 5 refers to knowing your strengths and your weaknesses. And oftentimes I talk about the issue of your patience. Sometimes we're very patient, sometimes we're not so patient. Sometimes we know what it is that our relative wants to say, and we just need to be active and let them say what we think they're meaning. And sometimes for our friends and relatives who know more than one language, their first learned language, which may not be English, may be Italian or French or German, may be coming back. And so our limitation is we're not familiar with Italian or French or German. And so we need to recognize that sometimes we're going to bring some strengths to the situation, and they are as well. And so knowing that you're going to be impatient, or you know you're going to need some other strategies to come into play, and it's okay to not know, but to be prepared to ask others for some help, I think will help optimize some of the communication. We want to bring out the existing skills for our friends and relatives, and ours as well too. The crazy term I often say is that we're not can't-adians, we are can-adians. And it's easy for us to be the criticizers and say the person can't do this, can't do that, can't write, can't say these words. But you know, the more important strategy for us is to think about what they can do and what we can do. And so we want to bring out the strengths and weaknesses, bring out the strengths that they have and minimize the weaknesses for them as well as for us, because we're about ramp building, not hurdles or fences. And so we want to bring out these optimizing and optimize their skills. 7 is, I think, the hardest part for many of us who aren't really familiar with the details of communication. And that is, how do we communicate? What do we communicate? Where and when? Means that we're raising our awareness of the speech that we use, which includes the sounds, the rate at which we speak, the loudness of our voice, the intonation patterns, the what we say or write. That includes the words that we write or say, the vocabulary that we use, the grammar, the syntax, where we say it in certain contexts, that is trying to have a conversation when we were able to in coffee shops, and I hope we'll soon get back to that, where there's lots of noise or visual distractions, which would be visual noise, may not necessarily be, you know, optimal for someone who has a dementia and an associated hearing problem or a vision problem. And when you communicate, the example I often give is that I can't really carry on a useful conversation with my wife after about 10:30 at night, because I'm so exhausted, I'm usually very tired. And so I just say, you know, let's have this conversation in the morning. On the other hand, my can't really have a productive conversation early in the morning with my wife because she's not an early morning person. So there are certain points in the day when people are going to be receptive to be speaking a little better and communicating a little better. So trying to raise our awareness of these how, what, where, when. Unfortunately, there's no recipe for this. There's no cookbook approach. There's no algorithm that if you do X, you're automatically going to get Y. And part of our enhancement strategies means we have to become a problem solver. I often use the term when I talk to my graduate students in speech language pathology, you want to be the Shirley or the Sherlock Holmes and reflect carefully, why did that not work so well? What is it that I need to solve in the problem or problems that occurred? And how can I make that better so the next time that won't occur? And so part of our role today is to make you a little bit more aware and in tune with communication and to be a bit of a problem solver about, and for that matter, even prophylactically preventing these problems from happening. Ultimately, the numbers 10, 11, and 12 become a key to these communication enhancement strategies. That is, we want to use communication that enhances the personhood or the self of these individuals who we love and care deeply for and whom we've had intimate and revealing relationships for decades of our lives. And we focus in on the person, not on the disease. And communication is really not about testing. You leave that to us as teachers or professors to test people, but our friends and relatives have close and intimate relationships with us. And so there's no need to test them. Oftentimes family caregivers have expressed to me, you know, if I just got to get him or her to say these words because I think that's part of the practice. And certainly practice is helpful, but don't turn it into a test where you already know that information and you want them to provide that just confirmation for you. That's not really helping the relationship. It may help with information exchange, but not necessarily because you already know that information. So I would urge you not to turn conversations or communication into a test, but to really focus in on that relationship you have and to build those bridges and to build the ramps and to break down the hurdles. Okay, so what I'd just like to reinforce this notion of self and personhood. A colleague of mine in the United States, Stephen Sabat, talks about this concept of self. It's well described in literature. He and the late Tom Kitwood from England talked about these elements of self among our relatives and friends who live with dementia. And we know that even in the middle to late stages of the disease where our friends and relatives may not be saying much, they do say words such as a pronoun, such as me and I and my, which reflects that there's still a self in there, even though they may not be saying a whole lot that sometimes makes sense or may not say a whole lot at all. They also will describe their self-attributes. I was a patient person, I was a talkative person, I was a quiet person, I was a reflective person, which again reflects the notion they still have that sense of who they are. And finally, there's evidence in the literature that our friends and relatives with dementia often talk about their profile in society. I was the treasurer of the Women's Guild, or at my church or synagogue or temple or mosque council. I was a coach of a dance team or a soccer team. And so those elements of the pronouns and their personality attributes and who they were in society are still woven within the person who has dementia. Sometimes we just have to work a little harder to try and get that out from them. The late Tom Kitwood talked about these positive care interaction strategies where we recognize in communication the person by their characteristics or their names. We negotiate with them. It's not just a one-way here, do this. We validate some of the words that they use or feelings that might be expressed. We collaborate with them and we facilitate these interactions in a variety of ways that I'll talk about shortly. But I think it's important for us to just remember that even though they may be having these memory problems, they're not doing these behaviors on purpose to bother us or to irritate us. That adds to our burden. But really, it's for us to be able to weave away some of those responsive negative behaviors and focus in on the person and the self who is still there. All right, so this is a diagram that represents, I call it the spoken wheel, of communication at the center, the hub, with all of these various ovals around on the rim that connect into communication, the language, the speech, the nonverbal. And I often go through multiple strategies for each of these ovals, like for language or nonverbal or conversation. And given the time for today's session, I can't go through all of the strategies for all of these wheels, but I'm going to try and highlight, I think, important ones for us that may be useful for you. Okay. So I am going to at least let you know that there are a variety of indirect interventions, and these are just some examples that colleagues of mine, Catherine Baelish and Cheryl Tomoeda in the United States, wrote about in terms of using various types of computer technology that will facilitate memory, remembering, and videos for life history, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in reminiscence therapy, and using virtual reality. One of my doctoral students has just finished a study on virtual reality and some of the technology. So there's lots of technical components for that. And again, it's a little bit beyond the scope of today's session, so I wanted to try and get down to some more common everyday type strategies. But I just want to let you know that there are lots of other interventions that include music and other sorts of memory devices that I'll mention, but we're going to talk a little bit more about some specific strategies I think that might be useful for you following that wheel. So with respect to language strategies, and in particular strategies for friends or relatives who repeat themselves, and that seems to be a common behavior among people with various types of dementia, and some of the strategies to deal with the constant repetition from our friends or relatives, such as, when are we going to the doctor? What are we having for lunch? What shall I wear today? There are some strategies that may help reduce that repetition. And some are evidence-informed, some of them are somewhat intuitive. Oftentimes, family caregivers can just listen patiently for why to the person's repetition problems and just answer that question. Part of the issue around the repetition is that the person with dementia is stuck in mental set, and they essentially have a needle stuck in the groove of a record. For those of you who remember what a needle and a record is, my students have no idea what that is. Or think of it as a laser on that sector of the hard drive. And so we have to try and get that needle out of that groove. And sometimes just listening patiently and answering the questions might be sufficient for them. We can also respond with the same answer. Yes, the appointment with Dr. Monroe is at 3 o'clock today. There is this strategy that Elvish and others talked about, which is described as therapeutic lying or bending reality. And so if our friend or relative is repeating the same thing over and over again, I got to get to work, I got to get to work. And of course, that they've been retired for work for a number of years. You could do the reality orientation approach, which was, oh no, you retired from the factory 17 years ago, but that doesn't necessarily get them, because their reality is they need to go back to work. So this bending of reality or therapeutic lying means you would respond in such a way such as, well, today's not your shift. And so you're going to their reality and adjusting the way in which you're thinking to meet their needs. Because what is your ultimate goal? To stop them from repeating. Sometimes just ignoring the repetitions can be helpful, but it's not always that helpful unless you use something else as a distractor, which comes on the next slide. There is this approach called validation therapy, where you acknowledge maybe the underlying driver for why they're repeating something. So for example, in the context of, I've got to go to Dr. Monroe, when's the appointment for Dr. Monroe? You've listened patiently, you've responded with the same answer. Our appointment with Dr. Monroe is on Tuesday, but they continue to go on with that. You might want to then consider validation, which would then be such as, you're asking about Dr. Monroe's appointment. You're asking about it a lot. You must like Dr. Monroe. Tell me about your meetings with Dr. Monroe. He's a great doctor, isn't he or she? And what you're doing is you're validating some underlying emotional issues that might be causing that person to perseverate, to stick on that particular topic. And so you validate that. So for example, someone says, I need to go home. I need to go home. They get all excited and anxious because they don't recognize where they are, even though they have been in a home. You might say, well, tell me about your home. Tell me about your home. Did that home have big hardwood floors? Did it have brass registers and those glass doorknobs? You must like your home because you're talking about the home. And essentially what you're doing is trying to get them to get that needle out of the groove of the record or that laser, that sector of the hard drive, but to get them onto something that might be motivating them to actually say, I need to go to the doctor, or I want to go home, or something that may be emotionally distressing for them that causes them to repeat. You can change the topic of conversation. After hearing ultimate times, when are we going to Dr. Monroe's office for the appointment, say, yeah, it's a lovely day today. Let's try and go out for a walk, and linguistically distract them. Or I'm going to jump to the bottom of the screen. You can change the activity. I'd like you to help me fold this laundry, or I need you to help me prepare the dinner for tonight. I want you to help peel the potatoes, or set the table, or pour the condiments, or what have you. And so changing the topic with the linguistic distraction, or changing the activity with physical, can help reduce these perseverations. Of course, other strategies that are now evidence-informed is you can have the client, your friend, your relative, read answers to commonly posed questions. You print them out on a card, or you can type them out on a tablet or an iPad, and have the person read that information, as opposed to you saying, the appointment is Tuesday for Dr. Monroe's office. You have them write it. Because what you're doing is changing the speaking, listening, to now reading comprehension, and that invokes different neural pathways, which seems to be easier to get the needle out of the record. There are other strategies that involve conversation memory notebooks that I'll get to shortly. But essentially, conversation memory notebook is a series of pictures, photographs, that you have that are relative to your family life, under which is written a simple active declarative sentence, a subject, a verb, and an object in present tense. And you go through 30 or 40 of these, either in hard copy form, or as we've done recently in a study, using an iPad tablet that allows the person to generate the sentence with your help. And then when they touch the picture with the cursor electronically, the voice comes up and it says, Bob and Margaret, Cuba, 1954. And so it's a way of getting them distracted and not repeating the phrases time and time again. That's conversation that comes out of Michel Bourgeois' work. Asking questions is also challenging for friends and relatives, and sometimes for them to understand our questions. And so if we ask them WH questions, what, where, when, why, that requires them to come up with the information. And their biggest problem is word finding difficulty. They can't come up with the words. And so we want to be able to ramp them up by giving them options, because their word retrieval that is coming up with the words on their own is not as good as word recognition. So if you give them options, do you want tea or coffee versus what would you like to drink, gives them the choice of tea and coffee. And of course, knowing them very well, you would offer them, would you like tea with milk or coffee with double cream? You know these people, you know our friends and relatives very well, and so you would know the strategies. And so sometimes it's if you want, you have an agenda to get specific information, to give them those choices, tea or coffee, or you offer in a question format for yes or no. Do you want coffee? Yes or no. Sometimes they'll refer to, I don't know, which means then that your longstanding history and knowledge of them, you'll have to fill in the blank on that. If, on the other hand, you're not really focused in on whether you want specific information, then you can use WH questions. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't use the WH questions, but if you are interested in having a general conversation, you don't really care where it goes, then WH questions are fine. How do you feel today? Where would you like to go for a walk this afternoon? Because your agenda could be anywhere. But if you have specific information you want, then I'd suggest you give the forced choice questions or the yes/no question. Okay? As you write or as you speak to them, friends and relatives, you want to use one idea per sentence. There's lots of evidence out of my colleague Elizabeth Rochaw's lab in Toronto. You don't want these long run-on sentences because our friends and relatives can process so much language information, and the memory issue associated with that, the cognitive, comes into play. And I'll show you in the next slide an example of that. And interestingly, there's lots of evidence to suggest if you place your modifiers after the main ideas, our friends or relatives will understand a little better. Do you want juice, apple or orange, which is a forced choice, versus the sentence, do you want apple juice or orange juice? Of course, you've lengthened it, but placing the modifiers after helps tremendously. For example, changing the adverb position here, let's go walking slowly, versus let's go for a slow walk. Roseanne Wilson is the former student of Elizabeth Rochon at University of Toronto who looked at the strategies of one idea or one direction at a time, which is part of what I talked about in the previous slide, and using these closed-ended questions and then paraphrasing and repetition to advance the comprehension of people with Alzheimer's type dementia in long-term care to understand instructions for hand washing after using the washrooms and using the washroom. And it was these strategies of one direction or one idea at a time and these closed-ended questions and paraphrasing or repetitions that actually facilitated the participants with the dementia to understand these instructions. Oftentimes our language gets to be quite figurative, and we use lots of these metaphors and similes, and we have to be very careful because they have multiple meanings. And so I'm not suggesting that we don't use flowery language or polite language. We just have to be very careful that there are words that have multiple meanings, like run or diamond, words that act both as nouns and verbs. Exit through the exit, picture the picture can be problematic. So we need to be careful about this figurative language component. As I alluded to earlier, our friends and relatives with dementia who are bilingual or polyglots have multiple languages, depending on the nature of their bilingualism, may lose the second or third learned languages and go back to the first learned language, even though it may not be English, and they may not have used it for a long period of time. So we have to be thinking about how we can communicate with those friends or relatives. For example, I describe here using the social lubricants, that is knowing some of the phrases, and maybe it's teaching spouses or children or grandchildren about some of the words in French or German or Russian that at least could be, hi, how are you? How are you feeling? Good to see you, in that particular language, so that our friend or relative then gets grounded in at least a context. And they may go off and talk in their language, and we may not get all of it, but we're going to give them at least the acknowledgement that we're at least attending to them. We may not get everything. This middle item here, using direct wording, is related to gender. Oftentimes, there are differences between the way men and women talk. No kidding. But in particular, it's the use of softeners or indirects like modals, could, should, would, might. And our friends or relatives who are living with dementia may not necessarily understand the could or the would or the should or the might in terminology. So you want to be direct without being abrupt or impolite, and still offering choices, but we can do that in a clearer way in terms of adjusting the vocabulary in our language. Okay? I'm conscious of the time now, and I know we're coming down to 10 minutes at the end, and I just want to be sure that we have some time for questions. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just finish up with these language strategies, and for those of you who want the rest of the slides, I've got all other strategies around cognition and speech and hearing and other components. But let me just finish up, if I may, with these last language strategies, and then I'll stop and answer maybe some of your questions. I alluded to earlier the notion of words that have multiple meanings, and clearly words used in sarcasm are not going to be understood. And so doesn't mean we don't want to be joyful and have jokes with them, but you can't expect your friend or relative is going to understand words that are used in a sarcastic way. And then using vocabulary that is personally relevant and trying to avoid the jargon, the medical jargon or the psychosocial jargon that goes along with this, and to be again, not to be demeaning in any way, to be person focused, but to use terms that they will understand. Finally, I want to mention this notion of where you place the important pieces of information in a sentence. It's a little technical, but I think it's important because there's lots of evidence to suggest that if you, after getting the person's attention, structure a sentence, a simple active declarative sentence with one idea, you put that important information right up front, then it's not going to be lost later on. Or for that matter, if you place a lot of extra information at the front that's not the main or core aspect of what you're saying, your friend or relative has to try and process that, but doesn't really get to the important piece of information in the latter part of the sentence. So I'd urge you to get your friend or relative's attention and then give the most important piece of information right up front in that sentence. Okay? So the rest of these slides are on cognition and other components, but I think, if I may, I'm going to try and see if we can go through some of the questions that we might have. Susan and Dina, maybe I could get you to come on board and help me with some of these questions. I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and maybe that might make it a little easier.
Absolutely.
How's that? Okay.
Yeah, no,
I see
that's
there's
great.
lots of questions or lots of items in the chat, and maybe only one in the Q&A session. But
So we have a comment actually from someone who says, thank you, very good presentation, your use of technology effectively. I felt in the same room as you.
okay, thank you. A question? There's one in the Q&A, or was that it?
Okay, so we have another one in the Q&A. It says you talked about the importance of relationships, how to maintain a relationship without creating a dependency.
Right. That's a very good question. We want to make sure that the strategies that Kit would about negotiating and collaborating and facilitating become foremost in our mind, because what that does is that recognizes that the relationship, well, we know is unequal in terms of skills and abilities and knowledge. We want to try and level that out by offering choices to our friends or relatives in a way that they understand that, by negotiating what they want to do. Now, for breakfast, you often have toast. This morning, would you like me to make you a waffle? Would you like to have a bagel, or would you like, so by providing those negotiations and options, you create, as best as one can, a balanced relationship using the words and options that they can understand. That's good.
Wonderful. So I just want to mention a couple of other comments we had in our chat box. People are sharing and saying thanks for the valuable information, and it's excellent. And we have another question that says, I find speaking in very short sentences helpful. I sense my dad can only follow this type of conversation.
That's a good point. The work that's come out of our a colleague's lab in the United States, Susan Kemper, has identified that short sentences are useful, but it's not just the shortness of them, it's the grammar that goes along with that too. Again, I'm down in the weeds here as a speech language pathologist, but having complex sentences that involves negatives or passive voice is problematic. So it could be short, but if it's in a negative, that is, you aren't going to do that today, are you? Is not that it's negative in emotional tone, but negative in the structure is problematic. So short sentences, yes, but in the active declarative sentence, that is a subject and a verb in the present tense, and then an object. And so short is good as long as it's not complex grammatically. Thanks for the question.
The next question says, therapeutic lying. My husband knows when I do it. How can I use it? Right.
And that's one of the caveats with therapeutic lying. It's got to be useful for that person in that context. We don't want to hoodwink them. It's not our purpose of bending reality. The bending of reality is, in this instance I gave you, is to stop them from repeating. And so you have to use it judiciously to make sure that it will accomplish what your goal is. And if your goal is to redirect them to something else, maybe therapeutic lying is not inappropriate. Maybe it's getting them engaged in other activities. Maybe it's just changing the topic. So you're right, therapeutic lying is not always that effective. And you just have to use it appropriately to achieve an end or a goal that's going to make them feel just as good about the outcome as us. And so this is not meant to deceive them in any way. It's to try and get to their reality and to try and acknowledge that reality by using information that might make that interaction relationship a little better. So, good question.
The next question, any suggestions for when patients' trust issues start to block communication? They are reluctant to communicate because they fear everyone is out to get them. Yeah,
that's a very good question. Particularly those individuals who become suspicious. I don't want to use the term paranoid. I'm not a psychiatrist, but certainly they become suspicious of all the information around them because they don't understand all of the complex relationships with what you're saying. And so it's important for you to be in those instances where there are there are instances of mistrusting, where you say, mom or dad or husband or wife, I know you don't necessarily trust that piece of information, but I'm your friend, I'm with you, I've been with you for X number of years, X number of decades, is to reinforce and build that trust with you. Because if they see you as somebody who's trustworthy and you're prepared to move them into X, Y, or Z communication topic, then they'll feel a little more comfortable about that. And it's about reassurance and to acknowledge that they're feeling anxious or potentially suspicious about that, but you're going to calm their fears, minimize their anxieties in a reassuring way, which again reinforces personhood, maintains their dignity, and acknowledges that even though you know it's not necessarily fearful and it's not truthful, their suspicion, but you acknowledge that. And because communication is this dyadic, this partnership, you got to make sure that you're bringing them with you and you are with them. And so I think ensuring you use words that reassure that it's not all that fearful, but you acknowledge that they're fearful of that, but you're with them and you're going to be supporting them through this context. See how that works.
Okay. What can you do when you can't get the needle out of the groove?
Well, my flippant response would be, then change the record. You want a better song? That's not the right answer. Then I would try and engage them in other physical activities, because particularly those individuals with dementia who have bilateral frontal lobe involvement, a part of the FTLD, frontotemporal lobar degeneration, they tend to get stuck in set, and they may also have these suspicions. And so oftentimes we have to work very hard in multiple ways to try and get them to be thinking about other activities that's going to absorb their perseveration on that particular topic. So I borrow this from my colleagues in occupational therapy and recreation therapy by having them engaged in physical, meaningful activities, which means folding laundry, preparing meals, doing the dishes, making the bed, helping with the laundry. And in some ways, those activities are partnership. You're getting them to do something productive that you want to have them to do, even though you may have to do it over again. It's not done perfectly. But you're also engaging them cognitively, that is designed to try and suppress why that needle is stuck in the groove and why they're perseverating on that particular one. It's by no means a panacea, but it's designed to try and get them both linguistically and physically out of that focused in on set. I can tell you that my more recent activity within the Canadian Centre for Activity and Aging has shown me, and some work I've done with some doctoral students, that exercise and physical activity, when done appropriately for the person's skills and abilities with the approval of the attending physicians, can also be very helpful. I don't know the literature about exercise and minimizing perseveration, but it's worth a try. Again, I wouldn't suggest doing activity and exercise that isn't authorized or approved by appropriate healthcare and medical people, but that might otherwise be an added element of, I hate to say the word distracting, but certainly getting them away from those perseverative thoughts and actions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orange, for this very comprehensive presentation on communication. Do you have any ideas about helping those with dementia understand why we cannot visit right now during the current COVID climate? We see it wearing on people, especially in long-term care or retirement residence homes.
Yeah, excellent question, Mary Ellen. Hello, how are you? Good to see you. Yes, the isolation that it's coming from people being prevented from going into long-term care homes. So this is where technology might be useful. It could also be problematic, and we have to use it appropriately, but certainly iPads, cell phones, where there are opportunities for FaceTime, or there are opportunities for Zooming or Skyping, even texting. Now, given all of that, you have to make sure that they can hear appropriately, they can see appropriately, that the font size is large enough. So again, it's not a panacea for all, but certainly using the technology can be very helpful. Marianne, let me give you an example. And for those who are still attending, I have a mother-in-law up in Sudbury who suffers from dementia. And lovely woman, 92 and a half years of age. She's English as the second language, first language is Italian, and she can't understand why my wife, Nadia, and I can't go up and visit her. And we speak with her 2 or 3 times a week through FaceTime. My sister-in-law, my wife's older sister, an only sister, brings the phone close and the iPad close. And so she interacts with us. And every time we talk with her, she's always complaining and bemoaning, why did you come and visit with me? And we have to just remind her that the police won't let us because of the virus, and the virus in Italian, and the pandemic that's happening. And we have to just constantly remind her about that and why we can't visit. It puts a lot of stress on Grace, my sister-in-law, but we constantly reassure her that, Mrs. Amadio, my mother-in-law, that we can go and visit when the police allow us. And there's a little bit of the therapeutic lying that comes into play here, because it's not really the police are preventing us, although I think there are some rules that would prevent people from London, Ontario, going to Sudbury, Ontario. But nonetheless, you're going. In this case, I have Grace and my brother-in-law up there to help remind their mother and mother-in-law that others can't come and visit, and particularly Nadia and me. And so we've used the technology to reach out, and with some support and guidance, along with a pocket talker, because my mother-in-law can't hear very well. So it adds a layer of complexity, but nonetheless, Grace has been very helpful. And so for those of you who can't get to long-term care, it's trying to build those relationships with the existing staff who are already overworked and underpaid, but hopefully we're acknowledging their support and tremendous help to set aside some time for interactions with mom or dad or grandma or grandpa in the long-term care facility. It does create a huge burden on them and the person with dementia and us as well too, the anxieties it's created on everyone's part about not being able to reconnect. That's a good question.
The next is a comment. It's a comment. Helpful strategies. Thank you. Can you talk about the memory notebook, please?
Right. Okay. So there are in the original literature, there was one form of it. It was a hard copy form in which, as I alluded to in my session, you have a photograph, not the original photograph, but some photocopy, or not photocopy, a duplicate of the photograph, because you don't want to use the originals. And Michel Bourgeois talked about placing it on a white sheet of paper, and underneath is printed either by hand or by printer in uppercase and lowercase, not all in uppercase because it's too hard to read everything in uppercase. Black on white background, no lines, a sad sentence, simple, active, declarative, a subject, a verb, and an object in the present tense. Again, Bob and Margaret in Cuba in 1954. And you place these second copies of the photographs on a sheet of paper. You slide it in behind a clear plastic, a non-glare sleeve, 3-hole punch it, put it into a binder, and you have 40 or 50 or 60 of these of photographs that are personally relevant for the person living with dementia, that go back to what is called autobiographical episodic memory. That is your personal memory of long time ago. And these photographs then are used as conversation starters. They're used for distracting individuals when they're highly perseverative, and they're meaningful reminiscence of a life lived richly. And so these photographs are used by family members, grandchildren, even those in long-term care facilities, to facilitate novel conversations. And Michelle has proven that even with these sad, simple, active, declarative sentence. I don't want people to misunderstand. It's not emotionally sad, but these simple, grammatically simple sentences act as a way of springboarding conversations. Now, in the more recent iteration of the study that Kelsey Dine, one of my master students, and I conducted, we used a software program called Pictello. Again, it's in the slides, the PowerPoint slides that I have. And Pictello is a piece of software that allows people to scan a photograph using an iPad, and underneath that photograph, in a single presentation, one slide, you can type in uppercase and lowercase, in font that is sans serif or sans serif. That would be Arial, Helvetica, Calibri, that is no little extra doodads, in uppercase and lowercase, your simple, active, declarative sentence. And in Pictello, you can then vocally record that sentence, Bob and Margaret in Cuba, 1954. And that can be done by the person living with dementia. She or he's voice can go in there. So you create these sentences with the pictures collaboratively, and then they become meaningful. And you swipe through and you touch the picture, and Bob and Margaret, 1954, Cuba, 1954, come up, spoken by the person with dementia. And so crafting and creating these in electronic format achieves the same sort of outcomes as the hard copy. Minimizing repetitions, positive engagement, personally relevant, creating novel or new utterances or statements that the person has, and rewarding interactions with the partner. And there's more details in slides.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there a strategy for emphasizing the importance of an issue? For example, the need to stay home during our current plague.
So, right. The definition of dementia, as I alluded to in my early slides, is that there is an impairment in memory, an impairment in judgments and reasoning, visual, spatial, language, etc. And so understanding the current pandemic that we have requires insightfulness and judgments and reasoning. And so trying to have our friend or relative understand why we can't visit them because we've had COVID-19, that's a pandemic, is worldwide, may be an unrealistic expectation. Part of the concept of what is called reality orientation is that we orient our friends or families or relatives living with dementia to our reality. And having a person who has blunted insightfulness and judgments and reasoning to try and understand our reality may be an unrealistic goal or unrealistic expectation. And that's going to vary across the clinical stages of dementia, right? In the earlier stages, they might have that awareness and insightfulness. It's probably eroding by the middle stages, and by the end stage, they're not able to understand that at all. So I suppose I don't mean to be rude by asking a question when you asked a question, but what is your agenda in having them understand the fact that you can't see them as related to that pandemic? And maybe there are alternate ways to get to your outcome. And your outcome is to have them understand that you're still with them and you can visit them in a variety of different ways until, in my example, the police let you do that, or the authorities let you do that. And so maybe, we unfortunately hang the police out to dry in this one, or some authority out to dry as the excuse. Someone who, or an authority that your friend or relative would understand and say, okay, well, I guess we can't do that. And just reassure them that by being with them either through the phone or FaceTime and through electronics, or even with letters that you can have sent into the long-term care facility, as long as your relative can read and understand, or for that matter, have audio samples sent in as well to be played on a digital recorder of some sort, a tape recorder or phone, that might reassure mom or dad or grandma or grandpa that you're with them, but without really giving the reasons why. Because even for those of us who are living in this, it's still hard to understand what a pandemic is and all of the implications for that. So I hope that's helpful.
Next question is, how do you differentiate negative behaviors versus verbal responses as being from dementia versus contrariness? I'm not saying that correct.
Yeah,
thank you. Sorry.
So you're looking for, what is the reason why I've got somebody who's being real recalcitrant in here? Was that just part of their previous pre-morbid personality disposition for that? And sometimes we may never know why we're getting these digging in the heels types of behaviors, even though we've tried very hard to figure out why. I'm meant to be a cop-out, but I suppose at this point, you'd have to know pre-morbid history of, is this person just always been ornery and cranky, or is this part of a personality that's just being manifest more because of the dementia, or is this from something completely new related to dementia? And I honestly, quite frankly, I don't know the answer to that, but we want to try and minimize those negative behaviors and maybe using strategies without necessarily knowing the cause of it, because sometimes it could be multiple causes. I know that's not the real best approach, but sometimes we may never know the answer to why these negative behaviors are coming out, and we have to try maybe multiple solutions, multiple options. Best I got.
My wife is 58, has advanced frontal temporal dementia, and has recently gone into long-term care. I am now communicating with FaceTime. Any advice? We try to communicate, but it is hard.
I acknowledge the difficulties that you're experiencing. Unfortunately, the current circumstances create added burdens for family members, for added stress on the caregivers in long-term care facilities. With the advanced FTD, the behavioral problems and stuck in set probably comes to the forefront, and so that means the staff have to try and for those who are able to work in that facility and work with your wife at this point in time to try and distract her and keep things going. Using the FaceTime means that you're going to try and interact using words or familiar terms for her. And it may very well be the case, depending on how you're using FaceTime, if it's through through a tablet of some sort, not necessarily an iPad, that maybe you're sharing pictures, trying to be creative about what you show, and there may be photographs. I go back to that because there's lots of evidence to support that aspect of communication. So maybe you're, depending on your wife's vision and how well she can sustain her attention, and whether there's anybody to help support her on that end to allow you to go through and review photographs. And again, I wouldn't bring out the whole photo album and have 3 or 4 on the page. You want to have one single picture, and maybe that might be a way of maintaining some connections, particularly photographs that are related to your marriage and or family and or children or relatives and or activities that are meaningful for her, that would be within her early to mid-teens and early to mid-20s, because that part of the memory system seems to be a little more robust than more recent memory. Hopefully that'll be of some use.
So I just want to mention we have roughly about 5 more minutes or so we'll try to get through as many more questions as we can. The next one is, when it becomes necessary to clarify information, my loved one has misunderstood. How do I do that without causing frustration?
That's a great question, and it actually taps into some of the research that I've done on it's called communication breakdown, or TSR, trouble source repair phenomena. So when part of my strategy is to then step back a little bit. How much is it important for your loved one to actually understand that information? Because there's a certain point in time when, after 1 or 2 tries, you abandon it and move on and change to the next topic. And so part of getting your loved one, your family member, to understand is to use some of the strategies that we know that are very helpful. That is, not straight repeating what you have just said because they misheard or weren't attending. And oftentimes when someone says, huh, or or what, the response is, I'll say it a little slower, I'll use the exact words, but I'll say it a little louder, assuming that they weren't attending, they weren't listening. And we know that straight repetition is not always that successful. What is much more successful is to paraphrase and to use synonyms if you need to have them understand what it is that you're trying to get them to understand, either they're listening or in reading. And so it's paraphrasing and not using the exact words, and simplifying the grammar and the syntax where possible. But the first question is, how many times do I want to do this? And is it important for me to even try it once? That's sort of the quick microsecond decision. Is this really important? Or then to abandon it and go to something else. If it's important, then I'd paraphrase and use synonyms, and I try it twice. I call this the baseball strategy. You get 2 times, 3rd strike, we're changing the topic. Not that you're out, but we're going to move on to something else. Because if after 2 tries, you can't get it, and they can't get it, you're going to get frustrated, they're going to get frustrated. So just move on. Well, you know what? I'm not sure I got all the answers to that. You accept responsibility for that, even though maybe it's they didn't get it. You can take that, right? Because you can take that and move on to something else, another topic.
My spouse is in long-term care. I am/was there daily. I am not certain that many staff are aware of these strategies. I try to model validation, etc. Are you aware of how much education on communication happens for PSWs and other staff?
Well, I understand the predicament in which you find yourself, that you're not there and you're trying to use the validation strategies, and it is stressful for you and for your relative. But I also understand the perspectives of the healthcare workers, the registered nurse, the nurse practitioners, and the healthcare aides and PSWs. One of the studies that I'm currently involved with, which was listed on one of the slides in my disclosure, is this B-EPIC study. It's an education and training program specifically for personal service workers, personal care workers. And my colleague Marie Savundarnagam, who's in the Faculty of Health Studies, where I am in the School of Health Studies, is running this study as part of Employment Development Services Canada. It's a large, nearly $500,000 grant to educate and to train PSWs about how to communicate with people with dementia. That's what Marie and I have been doing our entire lives. Marie more so on the long-term care PSW nursing care side, me more so on the family caregiver side. And I would acknowledge that the amount of education and training that the PSWs get on communication in general, and specifically with people with dementia, is far too small. And so Employment Services Development, or Employment Skills Development Canada, has acknowledged our grant, our grant application, and we're partway into that. Of course, we're now on a hiatus. We can't go in and educate them now, but it is a challenge for a variety of reasons, and so we're working on it. It's slow but surely.
Wonderful. How about if there is strong dynamics among couples, caregiver and dementia person, and no communication happening? What do they do for pill reminders and other future plans?
Right. So yes, I acknowledge that that people with dementia, people living with dementia, and their family and friends have had long-standing relationships. Sometimes not so great, but more often usually very good. And so trying to optimize communication, as I said earlier, it may not necessarily be anything that's said or not said. It may be just sitting there and sharing, looking out the window, and holding hands, and maybe listening to music. Because there's nothing you can't do with another person that doesn't involve communication. Nothing. Because they see you, they see your body language, they feel your skin, that you're warm or you're cold and clammy, or you're soft skin, or you've got rough hands. That all is part of communication. So even though you may not be saying words or listening to words or seeing words, you're communicating when you're with another person. Now, with regard to these pill reminders, I'd suggest you speak with your pharmacist. There are a variety of dosettes and blister packs. I'm trying to think of the right term. I should get it right because my wife's a pharmacist. That can be used. Now, some of you are still online may remember I talked about my mother-in-law, but suddenly, well, she's taken 2 or 3 doses of her daily pills because she can't remember that she's taken, even though she has the oh my God, the blister packs there, but she doesn't remember she's taking it. So this is where the monitoring has to happen. There has to be some control, particularly for medications that are life-threatening. So there are a variety of pill reminders, but that has to be monitored, especially for those that are very dangerous. So the blister packs.
A comment, great suggestions, and thank you.
Thanks, Mary Ellen.
Another great, great, yeah, thank you. And then another one is there software for the memory book on iPad?
I'm not a real technophile. We used a software called Pictello, Pictello. It's I think it was $29, $32 for one time, and you bought that. I'm afraid I'm not much of a technophile, so I can't tell you whether there are any pieces of software already on an iPad for that. We just used that particular piece of software because it had the verbal input and a spoken output. And so I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
Okay. And this one we've already answered. Okay, and it looks as though that was the last of our questions. There was just a comment in our chat box that I want to share with you. It says, thank you so much. I took the Care Essentials course and heard you in person in early March. And then being able to hear you a second time really helped me with internalizing more of the strategies. My mother with early Alzheimer's listened as well, and she got a lot out of it too. Thank you so much for offering this to everyone.
You're very welcome. Sucker for punishment.
So on that note, I'm happy to see that we were able to answer everyone's questions that were on board with us. So I'd like to extend a very, very special thank you to Dr. Orange for taking the time out of his busy day to present this valuable webinar for us. We're extremely thankful, and we know that you have helped many, many people. I would also really like to thank everyone who attended this webinar. We will be posting a PDF of Dr. Orange's presentation as well as the recording of the webinar on our website. When you exit the webinar, you will be asked to complete a short evaluation. Please take a minute to fill this out as it helps us plan for future events. The next webinar scheduled is on Friday, May the 15th, entitled Safety Planning, Tips for Mitigating Risk for Persons with Dementia and Care Partners. You can register online as you have done for this one. Thank you again for joining us all, and enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe. Thank you.